The evening air hung thick with summer warmth, as the last golden light of the sun dipped below the rooftops of London's Eaton Square. Gas lamps flickered to life, their glow casting long, wavering shadows along the cobbled streets. Behind the grand facade of one particular townhouse, a lavish gathering was well underway. The sound of conversation and laughter spilled from the open doors, the gentle clinking of crystal glasses underscoring the refined murmur of aristocratic society. Inside, the room was alive with movement. Ladies in flowing silks, their gloved hands wrapped around crystal glasses, conversed in hushed yet animated tones. Gentlemen in their formal coats stood in groups, their discussions oscillating between politics and war, all while a string quartet played a delicate melody beneath the golden chandelier. At the heart of the gathering stood Lady Tryon, poised and gracious, her eyes sweeping over the assembled guests with effortless charm. The night was proceeding just as it should, predictable, refined, unremarkable. Then, without warning, the atmosphere shifted. It was imperceptible at first, a strange stillness creeping in through the edges of the room. The hum of conversation faltered, voices trailing off mid-sentence. A hush rolled through the gathering like a slow-moving tide, swallowing the laughter and music in its wake. All eyes turned toward the doorway. The doors, once thrown open in welcome, now stood still. The warm glow from the hallway beyond flickered slightly, as though the very air in the house had thickened. A strange, quiet expectancy filled the space, an unspoken knowledge shared by all. Then, gently, deliberately, the doors began to move. No one was prepared for the strangeness that followed, nor for the moment they would witness something that would be spoken about for years to come. Something they would never forget. A figure emerged from the shadowed threshold, stepping into the golden haze of the drawing room at Eaton Place. The chatter of the party, London's elite, adorned in their silks and finery, faltered, then fell silent. Gas lamps hissed softly, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls, but it was the figure itself that drew every eye. Vice Admiral Sir George Tryon, resplendent in his full naval regalia, stood before them. His uniform gleamed with the weight of authority, gold epaulets catching the light, the deep navy of his coat stark against the pale faces of the observers. His presence was commanding, unmistakable, yet impossibly wrong. Lady Tryon, his wife, stood near the center of the room, a glass of sherry frozen halfway to her lips. Her eyes widened, a flicker of recognition warring with disbelief. The Vice Admiral had been at sea, commanding the Mediterranean fleet, far from the cobblestone streets of London. Yet here he was, or seemed to be, his boots silent on the polished floor as he moved forward with a slow, deliberate stride. The air grew colder, a subtle chill that crept up the spines of the guests, as if the room itself recoiled from his presence. No one spoke. No one dared. He did not acknowledge the crowd. His gaze, sharp and distant, seemed fixed on something beyond the room, beyond the walls of Eaton Place, beyond the city itself. The medals on his chest glinted faintly, a ghostly shimmer as he crossed the space. The silence stretched taut, a thread ready to snap. A woman in a crimson gown clutched her husband's arm, her breath catching in a stifled gasp. Another guest, a retired colonel, narrowed his eyes, as if trying to reconcile the man before him with the one he knew to be thousands of miles away. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The Vice Admiral reached the far side of the room, where the heavy drapes hung like sentinels against the night, and vanished. Not through a door, not into shadow, but simply gone. The air shuddered, a faint ripple of unease, and the lamps flared briefly before settling back into their steady glow. The guests stood motionless, their faces pale, their minds grappling with what they had just seen. Lady Tryon's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor in a cascade of crystal and amber liquid. The sound broke the spell, and a murmur rippled through the room, tentative at first, then rising into a tide of confusion and fear. How could it be? The Vice Admiral was not due back in England for weeks. He was a man of the sea, a titan of the Royal Navy, not a spectre haunting his own home. Yet the image lingered in their minds. The stern set of his jaw, the hollow intensity of his eyes, the way he moved as if drawn by some unseen force. It was no trick of the light, no illusion born of too much wine. Over 100 souls had seen it. Far from the glittering parlours of London, the Mediterranean sun beat down on a scene of unimaginable horror. It was June 22nd, 1893, and the waters off Tripoli, Lebanon, shimmered with a deceptive calm. The Mediterranean fleet, pride of the British Empire, steamed in precise formation, 2 columns of ironclad battleships cutting through the waves. At the head of the first column was HMS Victoria, flagship of Vice Admiral Sir George Tryon, a man renowned for his brilliance and feared for his iron will. Beside it, leading the second column, was HMS Camperdown, under Rear Admiral Albert Hastings Markham. The ships gleamed in the sunlight, their hulls a testament to naval might, their crews drilled to perfection. Tryon stood on the bridge of the Victoria, his figure a silhouette against the endless blue. He was a man of contradictions, a tactician of unparalleled skill, yet a commander who thrived on risk. His TA system, designed to allow captains to act with initiative, had revolutionized fleet maneuvers, but today he seemed intent on testing the limits of obedience. The order he issued was as baffling as it was catastrophic. At 3 p.m., the signal flags rose on the Victoria. The 2 columns, steaming parallel at a distance of 6 cables, 1,200 yards, were to turn inward, 180 degrees, toward each other. The officers on the bridge exchanged uneasy glances. The turning circle of a battleship like the Victoria was at least 800 yards, and the Camperdown was no different. At 6 cables apart, the math didn't add up. Collision was inevitable. Captain Maurice Bourke, standing at Tryon's side, cleared his throat. "Sir, with respect, the distance is insufficient. We'll need at least 10 cables to clear." Tryon's response was curt, his voice a low growl. "Leave it at 6, he demands." Bourke hesitated, then pressed again. "The turning circle, sir. 800 yards. We'll never make it." 6 cables, Tryon repeated, his tone final, his eyes fixed on the horizon. There was no room for debate, no space for doubt. The signal was hoisted, and the fleet obeyed. On the Camperdown, Markham saw the flags and felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He knew the order was madness, a death sentence written in cloth and rope. He delayed, his own signal flag hanging limp as he wrestled with the unthinkable. Defy his commander or follow him into disaster. From the Victoria, a sharp message cut through the tension. "What are you waiting for?" The rebuke stung, public and humiliating, and Markham's resolve crumbled. The Camperdown signaled acknowledgement, and the turn began. The sea, so serene moments before, became a stage for chaos. The Victoria swung inward, her bow cutting a graceful arc through the water. The Camperdown mirrored her, the 2 giants closing the gap with terrifying inevitability. Onlookers from the shore, military officers and civilians alike, watched in growing dread as the distance shrank. Aboard the Victoria, Bourke pleaded once more, his voice rising. "Sir, permission to alter course." Too late. Tryon's realization dawned in a single frozen moment. "Go astern!" he barked, but the command came as the Camperdown's ram, a steel blade designed for war, slammed into the Victoria's starboard side. The impact was a thunderclap, metal screeching against metal, the hull tearing open like flesh. Water roared into the breach, a 9-square-meter wound below the waterline, and the Victoria staggered under the flood. The deck tilted, a sickening lurch that sent men scrambling. Tryon remained on the bridge, his face a mask of grim acceptance. "It's all my fault," he said, his voice steady, even as the ship groaned beneath him. The Camperdown reversed, her own bow mangled, but the damage was done. The Victoria's watertight doors couldn't stem the tide, and within 13 minutes she was gone. Bow first, plunging into the depths, taking 358 souls with her. Tryon stood resolute to the end, a solitary figure against the tilting horizon, swallowed by the sea he had mastered. Back in London, the clock in Eaton Place struck midnight. The guests had dispersed, their voices hushed, and their steps hurried as they fled into the night. Lady Tryon remained, pacing the drawing room where her husband, or something wearing his form, had appeared. The shattered glass lay where it had fallen, a jagged reminder of the impossible. She searched the house, room by room, her calls echoing unanswered through the corridors. The servants watched her with wide, fearful eyes, their whispers trailing behind her like ghosts. Morning brought no comfort. A telegram arrived, its words stark and final. HMS Victoria sunk. Vice Admiral Tryon lost. June 22nd, 1893. The time of the sinking aligned with chilling precision to the moment the figure had crossed the drawing room. Lady Tryon sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she clutched the paper. The guests, too, would learn the truth, their stories spreading like wildfire through London's salons and clubs. Over 100 witnesses, all swearing to the same vision, Sir George Tryon, dead at sea, walking among them. The drawing room at Eaton Place stood empty, its silence heavy with the echo of that spectral stride, a moment etched into the city's memory, defying explanation. Yet the sea, vast and merciless, held other tales, other shadows cast across its waves. Decades before the Victoria met her doom, another ship, another captain, faced the unknown in a way that mirrored Tryon's haunting return. Far from the gaslit streets of London on a fog-choked night in 1866, the Atlantic cradled a secret that would echo through the ages, speaking of forces beyond human reach. The fog clung to the deck of the Great Eastern like a shroud, its tendrils curling around the massive iron hull as she steamed across the Atlantic in the summer of 1866. Captain George Nares, a seasoned officer of the Royal Navy, stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the horizon, or what little of it pierced the grey veil. The ship, a behemoth of engineering, was tasked with laying the transatlantic telegraph cable, a lifeline to connect continents. The crew moved with practiced precision, their breaths visible in the damp air, their hands steady despite the weight of the mission. But beneath the surface calm, an unease simmered, a whisper of something amiss. At precisely 2:47 a.m., as the cable hummed through the machinery and the ship groaned against the swell, a figure appeared on the quarterdeck. It was Nares, or so it seemed, clad in his captain's coat, the gold braid glinting faintly in the lantern light. His face was pale, his gaze hollow, fixed not on the crew, but on some distant point beyond the sea. The watchman froze, his lantern trembling as he called out. No answer came. The figure moved silently, its boots making no sound on the wet planks, and passed through the crowd of sailors as if they were shadows themselves. A young midshipman, clutching a coil of rope, swore he felt a chill as it brushed by, a cold that seeped into his bones. The apparition reached the ship's rail, paused as if to survey the endless waves, then vanished into the mist. The crew stood dumbstruck, their tools idle, their voices hushed. "It was the captain," one muttered, his words trembling. The captain was supposed to be on the bridge. A frantic check confirmed it. Nares was indeed at his post, alive and barking orders, oblivious to the spectre that had stalked the deck below. The men exchanged glances, their faces ashen. Their minds raced with tales of fetches and omens whispered in dockside taverns. Miles away, in a quiet parlour in Portsmouth, England, Nares' wife sat by the hearth, the fire casting long shadows across the room. The clock ticked toward 3 a.m., the same hour, adjusted for the sea's vast divide, that the figure had appeared aboard the Great Eastern. The door creaked open, and there he stood, her husband, soaked to the skin, his eyes dark and unseeing. She gasped, the needle slipping from her embroidery as he crossed the room without a word. He paused at the window, staring out into the night, then dissolved into the gloom. Her scream woke the household, but no trace of him remained, only the damp scent of the sea lingering in the air. Days later, word reached shore that the Great Eastern had nearly lost the cable to a sudden storm, a crisis averted by Nares' quick command. The crew swore the apparition had come at the exact moment the ship teetered on disaster, as if his will had split itself between sea and shore. In Portsmouth, his wife learned of the timing and wept, clutching the telegram that confirmed his survival. The Great Eastern pressed on, its cable binding the world, but those who saw the captain's double never forgot the night the sea seemed to claim him and let him go. What walked that deck? What stood in that parlour? The question hung like the fog, thick and unyielding, a riddle as old as the waves themselves. And so too does the mystery of Vice Admiral Tryon endure, pulling us deeper into the shadows of the inexplicable. As the years stretched on, the Vice Admiral's spectral march defied silence, pulling at the threads of reason and superstition alike. Explanations emerged, each more unsettling than the last, each daring to probe the impossible. Some proposed that what the guests saw was Tryon's spirit, torn from his body at the moment of death and propelled across continents to the place he held dearest. The timing is uncanny. As the Victoria plunged into the abyss at 3:31 p.m. off Tripoli, the figure appeared in London, over 2,000 miles away, adjusted for time zones. This theory leans on tales of crisis apparitions, visions of the dying seen by loved ones at the instant of their passing. The Vice Admiral, a man of fierce will, might have defied death's grip long enough to bid farewell to his wife, his home, and his world. Skeptics dismiss this as romantic nonsense, a product of collective hysteria. Over 100 guests, primed by the party's atmosphere and perhaps too much sherry, could have mistaken a servant or a late arrival for Tryon. The human mind, they argue, is adept at weaving patterns from chaos, especially when fueled by shock and grief. The telegram's arrival the next day simply cemented a false memory, aligning the sighting with the sinking through coincidence and suggestion. But how does this explain the precision of the uniform, the medals glinting in the lamplight, the stern gaze that no servant could mimic? Over 100 witnesses, from colonels to ladies of the court, swore to the same details they could not have conjured in unison. And what of the timing, so exact it defies statistical chance? If this was hysteria, it was an uncanny hysteria, a shared vision that pierced the veil of reason. Could Tryon's iron will, forged in command, have truly bent the laws of nature to leave this final mark? Another theory is that of a doppelgänger, a spectral double that walks the earth while its owner still breathes. In folklore, such apparitions herald doom, a mirror of the self unbound by flesh. Perhaps, as Tryon stood on the bridge of the Victoria, facing the collision he had wrought, a fragment of his essence broke free, a shadow cast across the sea to London. This was no ghost, but a living premonition, a warning of the fate he could not escape. But rational minds usually scoff at this, pointing to the lack of evidence for such phenomena. A more likely culprit, they say, is a psychological projection. Lady Tryon, anxious for her husband's safety, might have imagined his presence, her fear infecting the crowd through suggestion. The doppelganger is a myth, they insist, a relic of superstition with no place in a modern age of steam and steel. Yet the figure was not seen by Lady Tryon alone. Dozens of unrelated guests, with no shared anxiety, bore witness. A projection of one mind cannot account for the collective gasp, the shared shiver as the Vice Admiral crossed the room. And what of the folklore, persistent across cultures, of doubles that foretell death? If this was mere myth, why does it cling to Tryon's tale with such tenacity, as if the shadow itself demands to be believed? A more esoteric notion suggests a tear in the fabric of time itself. Tryon's death, so sudden and catastrophic, might have sent a ripple backward, a fleeting echo of his final moments imprinted on Eaton Place. The figure was not a spirit or a double, but a glimpse of the man as he stood on the sinking Victoria, his regret and resolve bleeding through the hours to manifest in London. This theory flirts with the edges of science, hinting at forces beyond our grasp. Skeptics may roll their eyes at this flights of fancy. Time, they argue, flows one way, forward, and no disaster, however tragic, can bend its course. The sighting was likely another individual mistaken for Tryon, the timing exaggerated by later accounts to fit the sinking's narrative. Human memory is fallible, and the story grew in the telling, a ghost born of embellishment. But memory alone cannot conjure a figure so vivid, so uniform in its details across 100 testimonies. The guests did not recount a vague shape, but a man in full regalia, moving with purpose. And what of Tryon's last words? "It is all my fault," spoken as the ship went down. Could that moment of guilt, so potent and raw, have punched through time itself, leaving an imprint too real to dismiss? Science may deny it, but the chill in that room lingers, a challenge to its certainties. The sea offered no answers. The Victoria lay silent on the ocean floor, her secrets buried with her crew. Tryon's final words echoed in the reports, a confession that carried a weight beyond the disaster. Had he known, in some unfathomable way, that his end was near? Had his will, so indomitable in life, defied death itself to return to Eaton Place? The inquiry that followed blamed him alone, a verdict that cemented his legacy as both genius and tragic fool. Yet the mystery of that night in London lingered, a thread of the uncanny woven into the fabric of history. Years later, the story persisted, whispered in darkened rooms and written in the margins of naval folklore. Eaton Place stood as a monument to the inexplicable, its drawing room a stage for a moment when the veil between worlds thinned. The Vice Admiral's doppelgänger became a legend, a figure of pride and terror, a man who, even in death, could not be contained by the sea. The lamps still flicker on stormy nights, the drapes sometimes swaying without a breeze, and some who passed by could have swore they saw a shadow in the window, tall, stern, and clad in navy blue, watching the world he left behind.